So good evening, everybody. Just to put ourselves in the mood, let's have the first verse of the famous Christmas carol. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about this evening is looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew, where he described the Magi and the appearance of the star in the east. And I'll be considering whether or not there are any astronomical candidates for what might be an explanation for the Star of Bethlehem. What are the candidates and how well do each of them fit the account of the Star of Bethlehem? And then I'll look at some astronomical dates and ask what actually happened when back in the time of the Nativity, and do any of the known events that occurred actually fit the timeline of the Nativity. Then I'll be using some planetarium software. I'll be using Starry Night to wind the clock back a couple of thousand years and have a look at what the sky would have appeared like back in those days, and then I will summarise. So let's have a look at Matthew's account, and let's think about the 5 aspects of the account that we're trying to explain with the Star of Bethlehem. So it's said that the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. Note that it doesn't actually say that they followed a star. That's what the Christmas carol says, but the Bible says they were prompted to go to Jerusalem. They were prompted by a star appearing in the eastern sky. They asked Herod about what's this we learn from the sky about the birth of a king of the Jews. And Herod was unaware of what they were talking about. He wasn't aware of such a prophecy. The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 aspects highlighted in red there are the 5 aspects that we would like to be able to explain with an astronomical candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. If we can hit 4 or maybe 5 out of 5 of those points, then maybe we've got a viable candidate. So let's just remind ourselves, to make sure we understand what the Bible says and what the Christmas carol says, let's just listen to the lyrics one more time of that opening verse. Okay, that's enough for that. We 3 kings of Orient are. That's what the Christmas carol says, but we have to remember that the Bible doesn't tell us that there were 3 kings or 3 magi. It doesn't mention, actually, the number of people that came. All that's mentioned are the number of gifts that were brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, it's often assumed that there were 3 magi or 3 kings. In other words, the possibility that there were actually 20 of them, 3 of whom brought gifts and the other 17 who didn't, that's not considered. If there were 3 gifts, it's assumed that there were 3 magi. But it doesn't actually say that, so we really ought to take 3 out of that Christmas carol. And as I've just said, when we're talking about the Magi or the wise men, well, that doesn't translate as kings, so we can't really assume that there were 3 kings. We don't know the number, and whatever number there were, they weren't kings. So let's take kings out of there as well. So what are we left with? We 3 kings of Orient are. Did they come from the Orient? Well, we don't know where they come from. It doesn't ever specify. The Bible doesn't say they came from the Orient. They came from somewhere to the east of Jerusalem, but was it the Orient or was it next door? Was it Persia? Quite possibly. They might have been priests from Persia. Were they from India? Were they from Mongolia? Well, it doesn't actually say in the Bible, so we ought to take the geographic origin out as well. And as I mentioned in one of my opening slides, they didn't follow yonder star. They were prompted to travel west by the appearance of a star in the east. They didn't follow the star. So we should take that out as well. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And being a scientist, I prefer accuracy. So instead of those lyrics that we've put up there, we really ought to replace them with more accurate lyrics. So instead of "we three kings of Orient are," we really ought to say "we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are." And instead of "following yonder star," we ought to simply say "saw a star." And from that you can see why scientists, and particular physicists, why we don't write Christmas carols. And when we're talking about the three wise men, remember 3 is an invented number. We don't know how many wise men there were. So we ought to talk about not the 3 wise men, but the n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 because it's plural and less than infinity. So that's just something to bear in mind. The Christmas carol is how a lot of people remember the tale of the Star of Bethlehem, but the Christmas carol is relatively inaccurate compared to what the Bible says. So let's just ask ourselves, what do we mean by a star when we talk about the Star of Bethlehem? A star doesn't mean a star in the astrophysical sense that we understand it today, because star can be essentially anything that appears in the night sky, other than, I guess, the moon. So, for instance, we have wandering stars. Most of the stars in the sky are fixed, not fixed in the sense they don't rise and set, but fixed in the sense that they are fixed relative to each other. The constellations are fixed patterns. So as the Earth spins, of course, the stars appear to move across the sky, but in fixed patterns. But as well as those fixed stars, there are these wandering stars. Stars, some of them quite bright, that move amongst the fixed stars. And these wandering stars are what we now know as planets. And some stars are broom stars or hairy stars, stars that seem to have a tail. And of course we would now call these objects comets, and we understand what they are in terms of ice balls moving around the solar system. And of course one aspect of describing what we see in the night sky as stars is still with us in a shooting star. So we might call them meteors, but it is very common to call them shooting stars. So you can see wandering stars, hairy stars, shooting stars. They're not necessarily a fixed star, a ball of gas that's burning hydrogen into helium as we would understand it. It could simply be an object seen in the night sky other than the very familiar moon. So that's one thing to bear in mind when we talk about what could the star have been. Do we get any sort of clues, do we get any sort of clues by looking at any depictions of the adoration of the Magi, for instance? Here's Botticelli. It's believed that the person on the extreme right here is Botticelli himself, effectively photobombing his own painting. And do we get a clue? Well, right at the top centre there appears to be the Star of Bethlehem, but of course it doesn't really tell us what that star is. It seems to be just a light beaming down, a beam of light onto the baby Jesus. In the background there we have Joseph looking rather bored, taking no part in the celebration whatsoever, but perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he took no part in the conception either. Do we have any other depictions of the adoration of the Magi? Well, there are plenty of them throughout history, but again, the Star of Bethlehem in the background, we can't tell what that is. The only depiction in which we can actually see the character of the star is that from Giotto, in which the star appears to be depicted as what appears to be a comet. There's virtually no other way of interpreting that ball of light with a very long tail behind it. So perhaps Giotto was trying to indicate that the Star of Bethlehem could have been a comet. There are other depictions of the adoration of the Magi, Rubens for instance. In this particular case I looked and couldn't actually see a representation of the star in the background, though there is, rather interestingly, a two-headed camel that seems to be also paying respects. Others, the Star of Bethlehem is up there in the top left, and again a small beam of light appears to be coming down in the direction of the baby Jesus, which is also true of this Van Lint. Again, what appears to be a point-like star beaming some light down onto the infant Jesus. But it's no surprise to learn that we don't actually find anything useful from these paintings. Of course, they were painted many centuries after the Nativity, and generally speaking, the depiction of the scene, always 3 individuals, always 3 magi, even though the Bible doesn't say that, And of course, the painter is painting the classic popular representation of the adoration of the Magi. There are still some unmuted microphones out there if people would like to mute. So we can ask ourselves, what is the astrological significance of what goes on in the sky? Remember that every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation had an astrological significance. And across many cultures, for instance, Venus was seen, because it was such a bright planet seen in the morning sky or the evening sky, Venus was often associated with beauty and fertility and birth. And Jupiter, the king of planets effectively, is usually associated with royalty. Jupiter was the king of the gods and hence is the king of the planets. Regulus is the brightest star in Leo, and as you can perhaps tell from the name, or at least the first 3 letters of the name, Regulus is associated with the king of stars. Leo itself, as a constellation, is often seen as a lion throughout different cultures, and for various cultures it's associated with the Lion of Judea. The land of Judea and the tribe of Judea had a flag which was depicting a lion, and hence the lion in the sky was often associated with the Lion of Judea. So why would astrologers look at the sky? Why would they assign any significance to what was seen in the sky, even if it was stars or planets or constellations? Well, you have to remember that it was believed that God was telling man what was likely to happen in the future by arranging the sky, the night sky above them. So in other words, if anybody wanted to know what is the next harvest going to be like, is there a flood coming, is there going to be a plague, is there going to be a drought, is there going to be a change of kings, or is there going to be a war? If you want to know these things, you look at the sky, because that is where God tells you what is about to happen. In other words, you can think of the sky as God's Facebook page. And so you keep watching the sky every clear night, because that's when you learn what's going to happen in the future. So it's important to keep an eye on the sky. So let's have a think about a few possible star candidates and ask the question, does it possibly meet the criteria of a star appearing in the east? Would it have been significant? Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Could the star reappear in the sky, and could the star stop in the sky? So let's have a look at the first star candidate. Let's think of shooting stars. Is it possible that a meteor shower was the Star of Bethlehem? Well, you know what meteor showers are like. The meteors will appear all over the sky, so it's not clear why you would associate a meteor shower as a star in the east rather than in any other part of the sky. And meteor showers happen all the time, essentially a few per year, pretty much every year, and therefore there's no reason why you would assign any particular significance to it. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, yes, because it's not really significant. That's fair enough. And could the star reappear in the sky? Well, we know that meteor showers come and go. Some nights you see a lot of meteors, other nights you see rather few, and so a meteor shower could reappear in the sky at a later date, for sure. But what would you interpret as the star stopped in the sky? It's difficult to see how you can take a shooting star or a meteor shower and talk about a star stopping in the sky. So it meets some of the criteria, but not all of them. What about the appearance of a comet? Could it have been a comet seen in the east? For sure it could. Would it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough, it would have been considered significant. As a harbinger of doom, perhaps, or a harbinger of some sort of good or bad news. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said comet? Herod's eyesight wasn't good, but he would have had a whole team of astrologers telling him what was going on in the sky. So it doesn't seem likely that a particular bright comet seen by the Magi would not have been seen by Herod's astrologers. Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, I guess that's possible. Comets are going around the sun, and it might disappear behind the sun for a little while and then reappear on the other side of the sun. So yes, it could reappear in the sky. But it's not clear how you could interpret a comet as a star stopping in the sky, though it is just about feasible to think about a comet moving across the sky from west to east and then, depending on its orbit around the Sun, perhaps stopping and then moving backwards. What about the appearance of a new star? What about a nova in the sky? Not a new star in the strict sense, but a star that becomes visible after being below naked eye visibility for a while, possibly for a long while, temporarily gets bright enough to be seen with the naked eye. Could such a star appear in the east? It could. Would it be significant? If it was bright enough, it could. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said appearance? Well, again, if the star is bright enough to be significant, why wouldn't Herod be aware of the appearance of this star? Could the star reappear in the sky? That doesn't seem very likely from our current understanding of nova, where we do get recurrent nova that get bright and dim and then at some point later get bright again, but that is usually years or decades later rather than in a short time frame. And could the star stop in the sky? Well, a nova is just one of the many fixed stars. It's already fixed. It's already moving with all of the other fixed stars. It's in a particular point, in a particular constellation. So why would you talk about that star stopping in the sky when it's already a fixed star? So that doesn't seem to work. And a supernova might be quite spectacular, but suffers from the same problems. It could appear in the east. It would be significant. If it was really bright, Herod would have been aware of it, and once a star has gone supernova and blown itself apart, it doesn't tend to do that a second time, some weeks or months or whatever later. And again, how can you talk about a supernova stopping in the sky? So those four don't seem to fit the facts, but there is one candidate for the Star of Bethlehem that seems to be able to tick all the boxes, and that is a conjunction of planets. So planets are going around the Sun at different speeds, and every once in a while two planets will appear to be in the same part of the sky. They won't necessarily be very close. As they pass each other, as they move backwards and forwards in the zodiac, they will tend to miss each other by perhaps a few degrees or perhaps a fraction of a degree. But such a conjunction of planets, the astrological symbol is given there as a little dumbbell symbol. It is possible for a conjunction of planets to appear in the east. It could be significant, as I've said earlier, depends on the planets and which constellation they appear in. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said conjunction? Well, he might have been aware of the conjunction, but didn't necessarily assign the significance that the Magi did, so that's a possibility as well. Can a conjunction reappear in the sky? Yes, the planets are always on the move, so a star can reappear in the sky. And can a planet stop in the sky? Well, yes, it can, for the reason I'll show very shortly. Let's just remind ourselves about how planets move. If we just take two hypothetical planets, one inner and one outer, we remind ourselves that the planet closest to the Sun has a stronger gravitational pull and hence move faster to stay in its orbit. And so as the planets go around the Sun, at different times of the year, they will appear in different parts of the sky, but around this time they appear in the same part of the sky, and at a time later, again, the planet that's on the inside track is moving faster, and so again we get a planetary conjunction at certain times. And here I'm saying a planetary conjunction as seen by somewhere in the vicinity of the Sun. Those planets are in the same part of the sky as indicated in that particular graphic. So the different speeds give rise to planets in conjunction or moving past each other. And the one other thing we need to bear in mind for what's going to come is the idea of a planet moving backwards, or at least appearing to move backwards. If we have both of these planets, let's imagine the green planet is Earth and the red planet is one of the outer planets, so it could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, for instance. Remember that Earth will be moving faster than the outer planets simply because it's closer to the Sun. So although all of the planets will be going around the Sun in the same direction, so all the planets will tend to go from west to east night after night if you watch them against the fixed stars, they will tend to go from west to east. But when the Earth overtakes, let's say, Mars on the inside track, just like if you're on a motorway and you're doing 70 miles an hour and you overtake a car doing 60 miles an hour, that car will appear to go backwards temporarily. It's the same idea with planets. Every once in a while, the outer planets will appear to move backwards simply because the Earth is overtaking them on the inside lane. So if we think of how that planet moves against the fixed stars of the sky, what would happen is the planet would move from west to east, but at some point it would stop in the sky, start to move backwards, stop again, and then start to move forwards again. And we can just run that one more time so we can see that moving from west to east, but then the planet stops in the sky, moves backward because of the overtaking Earth, stops the second time, and then continues in its slow drift from west to east. And that can happen for any of the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So now we've got an idea of how that motion can take place. Let's have a look at the possible candidates by looking at what actually happened in a few years BC. Bear in mind, if you want to try this for yourself using planetarium software, do a double check and make sure your software doesn't introduce a year 0. It's a known bug with some software that if you go backwards 3 AD, 2 AD, 1 AD, go back another year, it displays it as 0, which it shouldn't. It should go from 1 AD to 1 BC. So bear that in mind. Some planetarium software is off by 1 year. So when was Christ born? Well, we don't know. Some people say Christ was born somewhere in that time period from 8 BC to 4 BC on the assumption that King Herod died in 4 BC and King Herod was alive when Christ was born. Other people believe that no, the death of King Herod has been incorrectly dated. The death of King Herod is dated relative to an eclipse of the moon which came after a flood which came after something else. And some people believe that we've got the wrong eclipse and he actually died in 1 BC, in which case Christ might have been born a little bit later. Quite why there's a gap between 3 and 4, I am no biblical scholar, so I don't understand why people do not believe that Christ could have been born perhaps between 3 and 4 BC. My apologies. So let's have a look at what might have been in the sky. Well, there was a comet around in 12 BC, that was Halley's Comet, and it probably was quite bright. We can't be absolutely sure because comets, well, they're like cats, they have tails, and they're unpredictable. So we can work out where comets are in the solar system by working out where they are now and dialing the clock backwards. But it's very difficult to work out just how bright they would have been because that depends on how the sun is evaporating the various ices in the nucleus in order to produce a tail. So Halley's Comet might have been quite bright, but why would God have posted on his Facebook page in 12 BC about the birth of the King of the Jews many, many years later? That doesn't seem to fit. Another comet was in the sky in 5 BC. That was Comet Holmes, which some of you might have observed and photographed a few years back in the middle of the noughties. This was the comet that suddenly expanded up to about the size of the Sun due to rapid expansion of the coma of the comet. But we don't believe it would have been very bright in 5 BC. 4 BC saw the comet Churyumov-Gerasimenko, in other words, the comet that was visited recently by Rosetta and landed on with the little lander Philae. That comet would have been in the right part of the sky in 4 BC. But we don't think it would have been bright enough. It wasn't bright in the recent transit around the Sun, and we don't think it would have been bright in 4 BC either. So that doesn't seem to fit the facts. They were in the right place in the sky, they would not have been bright enough. What about a nova? Well, the Chinese recorded a nova in 5 BC and the Koreans recorded a nova in 4 BC. Now, you wouldn't expect a very bright nova that's easily visible with the naked eye to come along too often. Perhaps 1 or 2 every century or so. So is it possible that there was very little activity and then 2 came along in consecutive years? Doesn't seem very likely. It's thought more likely that the dates have been slightly mixed up when translating from the Chinese and Korean calendars into the calendar that we use. So perhaps that was the same nova observed in late 5 BC or early 4 BC by Chinese and Korean astrologers. But we don't think nova fit the facts for the reasons I gave on an earlier slide. So then we come to, well, what possible conjunction might there have been? And there were, in fact, a set of conjunctions. I've used the astrological symbols here with the key in the bottom left there. There were conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in about 6 BC, much like the one we saw last December, when Jupiter and Saturn again were relatively close in the sky. But actually, I think more interesting is the fact that there were a series of conjunctions between Jupiter and Venus between 3 and 2 BC, shown on the right-hand side there. And although we can't be certain which of those might be the Star of Bethlehem, I think it's very interesting to look at the Jupiter and Venus conjunctions with some software to see what actually happened. And that's what we'll do here. So I'm going to run a video of a planetarium software. I used Starry Night, and I'm going to run it starting in August 3 BC. I don't know where on the Earth I should be looking, because I don't know where the Magi were when they saw the Star of Bethlehem. So I've just taken the location as being the centre of the Earth, rather than Persia or India or Mongolia or somewhere else. So there'll be a very small error by taking the centre of the Earth rather than the surface of the Earth. But if you think of the distance to Venus and Jupiter, it should make essentially very little difference. I haven't labelled everything in this image, because if you have all the labels switched on, it gets very confusing. I also have switched off the horizon, because if we run a time lapse forward, the horizon jumps around all over the place, and that gets very confusing. So I'm just staring at a patch of sky that has the constellation of Leo and the planet Jupiter, which is the one thing I have labelled there. To the right of Jupiter, sitting in the constellation of Cancer, the large blob there is the planet Venus. So there's Venus sitting to the right of Jupiter. And as these objects move backwards and forwards along the zodiac, they'll be moving, roughly speaking, from bottom left, top right. So from top right to bottom left in the normal prograde, in the normal direct motion around the Sun. So let's run the clock forward and see what we actually see. Venus, remember, is an inner planet which is moving faster than Jupiter. So over the next few weeks, Venus catches up with Jupiter. So there is a conjunction of Venus with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. How close is that conjunction? Well, it's similar to the one we saw Jupiter and Saturn last year. In other words, Jupiter and Venus would be quite close together. They would both be quite bright. They'd be quite close together, but they would still be 2 points of light. They would be, I think, closer together than, let's say, the diameter of the full moon. Let's take that as a yardstick. A ½ degree is the diameter of the full moon. Venus and Jupiter would have been closer in the sky. Venus would have been about magnitude -4. Jupiter would have been a magnitude of -2 to -3. Two very bright objects, and at this time of year, that would have been seen before the sun rises. So this conjunction of two bright planets would have been seen as a star in the east before sunrise. And what would be the astrological significance that might have been applied? Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus representing birth, Jupiter representing king, Leo representing the line of Judea. So what we have here, Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo, birth, king, Jew. So maybe this is a sign that relates to the birth of the king of the Jews. So the astrologers might have been quite interested in this particular conjunction, seen as a star in the east in late 3 BC. Let's move on. Venus is moving faster than Jupiter, so it's going to move out of our field of view, and Jupiter is going to continue moving from west to east. And it passes, you notice, the brightest star there in the constellation of Leo. The king of planets, Jupiter, has just passed the king of stars, Regulus. Okay, that happens from time to time, nothing special there. But as the months continue, we're now November 3 BC, Jupiter has stopped in the sky and is starting to move backwards, the retrograde motion that I showed you earlier. Remember, that's the Earth overtaking Jupiter on the inside track. So Jupiter goes backwards and passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars for a second time. We're now in the spring of 2 BC. Jupiter stops in the sky one more time and continues its prograde, i.e. west to east motion. And the king of planets passes the king of stars a third time. So the king of planets and the king of stars have passed each other not once, not twice, but 3 times. It's as if there's a little dance of the kings here. Maybe one king is passing the crown to another king. That's how it might have been interpreted by an astrologer. But the most interesting thing is what happens in the next couple of months. Jupiter is going to continue drifting from west to east, but Venus is now, having gone round the sun once, Venus is now going to catch up with it for a second time. And Venus here, if we run the video forward, catches up with Jupiter again, and again in the constellation of Leo. So Venus, for a second time, is in conjunction with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. The first time that happened, the astrologers said, maybe something interesting is happening, birth King Jude. Now, Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction a second time, but if the first conjunction was a near miss, this conjunction would have made the 2 objects appear as one. They would not have stayed as 2 points of light. They are close enough in this conjunction to effectively merge together as far as anybody's eyesight is concerned. No telescopes in these days, but let's just pretend we have a telescope and zoom in to see just how close Jupiter and Venus were at this conjunction in June of 2 BC. Let's zoom in and see. Okay, that tells you how close Jupiter and Venus got in the sky. This particular software doesn't show Venus as a blindingly bright planet. It shows you what the surface would look like if you stripped all the clouds away. So remember, Venus is actually going to be a very bright object. But the scale here is approximately 1 arc-minute vertically, and the visual acuity of most humans is at best about 1 arc-minute. So these objects are much closer than you can possibly resolve. So 2 very bright planets have for a second time come into a conjunction in Leo, and they have merged as 1 very bright object. And then over the course of days and weeks, they will of course separate again and resolve themselves into 2 separate objects. But a conjunction that is this close is very rare. I haven't found how to calculate exactly how rare, but I would guess it doesn't happen many times in a millennium. So the astrologers that saw this would almost certainly have never seen anything like this before. So let me just recap what the Magi might have seen in 3 to 2 BC. In August, they would have seen Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo, relatively close, not spectacularly close, but relatively close, which could have been interpreted as birth of the King of the Jews. Over the next few months, the King of Stars and the King of Planets went past each other, the planet going past the star 3 times, so a triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. That might have been interpreted as one king is passing over to another king. And then in June of 2 BC, we have this spectacular conjunction where Jupiter and Venus would have been so close together they could not be resolved by the human eye. Perhaps that was the starting pistol that told the Magi, okay, something is definitely happening in the land of Judea, go and find out. We don't know how long it would have taken them to arrive, because we don't know where they started from, and we don't know if they were on foot or on camels, despite what the Christmas cards may suggest. But this is pure speculation. Some months after June of 2 BC, Jupiter again stopped in the sky. On what date did Jupiter stop in the sky? It stopped in the sky on 25th of November. Let me start that again. On the 25th of December, it stopped in the sky. We know that's just a coincidence in the sense that we know the birth of Christ was not necessarily on the 25th of December. That's just an old pagan festival that was taken over by Christianity. But it's sort of interesting to note that Jupiter did stop in the sky on the 25th of December in 2 BC. Maybe, perhaps, that's when the Magi arrived, though of course that is pure speculation. Well, actually, all of this is pure speculation, in the sense that It might have been this conjunction of Venus and Jupiter that inspired the account of the Gospel of St. Matthew. And it might not. It might have been a different astronomical event or a combination of events that actually inspired the Gospel. The bottom line is that it's easy to determine the astronomical facts. We can determine where Venus was, where Jupiter was, with very high precision, and work out where they were in the sky and what it would have appeared like. But of course, second-guessing the significance that that particular appearance in the sky any individual, such as the Magi or King Herod's astrologers, would have attributed to that event, second-guessing the significance is pure speculation. But the bottom line is, regardless, the underlying message, of course, is still the same. I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas. Thank you all for listening.